Alright, so let me ask you a question. Do you think we get enough pulls in HSR? I mean, obviously, it's always nice to have more so you can roll for your next anime girlfriend or whatever, but I wanted to actually explore the current state of the game a little bit and see what we actually need those pulls for and try to see if we really do need more or not. What really got this on my mind was thinking back to how HSR felt when it first came out. I remember it being a game that was actually praised for the amount of pulls we got, at least compared to Genshin anyway, since that's what came before it. Back then, honestly, it felt like you were able to get pretty much everyone you wanted within reason, and at least in my experience, it also felt like I had enough extra to get a light cone every now and then. Now though, I feel that's largely changed. Really, at least in my opinion, it doesn't feel like we get the same mileage out of our pulls that we did in the past. Honestly, it feels like characters seem to last for lesser amounts of time and also have a lot higher requirements to actually play them. So today, I'd like to give my thoughts on how I feel it's changed and also why I feel those changes aren't really that great for the players. I think the first thing we can discuss is something that pretty much every gacha seems to be using nowadays, and what I'm referring to here is something I mentioned a couple videos ago when talking about the state of HSR's meta, which is their balancing formula. To keep it brief for those of you unfamiliar, most gachas nowadays operate under a system where there is a base power floor for all the characters in the game, but it rises over time. Or in other words, it's basically the idea that as the game progresses and we get stronger, the game's difficulty will rise to match that. But every unit in the game has a theoretical height of power that they can reach, and certain units will naturally have higher heights than others, usually related to how recently they were released. It's also particularly noticeable in terms of rarity, where 4-star units will generally fall off at some point, or at the very least they'll be replaced by 5-star units that can do what those 4-star units did, but, better. What this all does is increase the effective cost of each of the teams that we play. Like, getting a 4-star to E6 is something that will naturally happen over time, and therefore it's not really a big deal to fit them into different team compositions. But when they don't really cut it anymore, you have to replace them with a better unit, and that means more rolls that you have to spend. So basically, instead of the game working in a way where you can kind of go for whoever you want and get a light cone for your favorite on top of that, for example, it now runs in a manner where at some point you will have to spend your pulls to get a new character just to complete content that you were able to complete with other units in the past. In other, more simple terms, in my opinion, rolling for units and then getting their light cones used to feel like a luxury rather than a necessity, whereas now it kind of feels like the opposite. Like, I still remember at the beginning of the game when the super cool showcases people were doing were done with teams that didn't have a full lineup of 5-stars with their light cones and an S10 DDD or whatever. I remember when the 4-stars that were meta slowly started to fall out of it as better and better characters were released. I remember when I rolled my first signature light cone for Fu Zhuan just because I liked her and not because she actually needed it. At least in my opinion, it's not really like that anymore because it feels like we're now expected to have certain things to participate in different endgame content. I mean, think of how many characters want not even Hyacine but just her light cone to function at max potential. Stuff like that just wasn't a thing in the past, and personally I don't know if I like the fact that the game has been moving in this way because, as I always say, it takes away the choices a player has when deciding what to roll for, and honestly that's kinda just frustrating. Now, that said, to be fair to HSR here, this isn't a problem unique to this game specifically. Pretty much every mainstream gacha nowadays slowly filters out their lower rarity units and eventually replaces even higher rarity units with new characters. For example, in Genshin, out of the 47 4-star characters in that game, I'd say only around 25% of them are actually frequently used. Wuwa has an even lower percentage, and ZZZ is slowly starting to filter out their 4-stars too. Despite it being normal, I do still think it's something we need to keep in mind as we look at how the overall cost of teams have risen over time. Something that is more unique to HSR though is the lack of 4-star characters in general. I mean, being honest, HSR's 4-star characters aren't actually all that bad in the grand scheme of things, or at least they weren't before they got shuffled out for better options. Hunt March, Gallagher, Tingyun, Pella, Moze, all of those guys used to be decent options, but due to Hoyo seemingly deciding to no longer release characters like them, it's put the game in a bit of a weird spot in my opinion.
Oh, that's hot. That's hot.
Like, in an ideal world, as 4-star characters do eventually get filtered out, at the very least new ones could come in to replace them as the alternative options to 5-stars that also come. For example, if Gallagher stops being good at some point, ideally there would be a Gallagher 2 coming in to kind of fill the niche of an easily accessible but, good enough sustainer for accounts that don't have any better options. We actually saw something like this happen previously with Gallagher effectively replacing Lynx during 2.x. But now, without this happening because they simply aren't being released anymore, there's just no alternatives to use besides a 5-star, so in essence it kind of becomes something like a double whammy. Not only are there 4-stars that we currently have basically moot unless your account is new or you like hyper invest into them, but they also don't release any new ones to keep an influx of characters available for players to keep up with the current game state. And that's not even mentioning that 5-star characters aren't immune to this filtering. Like, think about it, how often do you use the meta characters from 2.x nowadays? How about from 1.x? Characters can be filtered out at any point as new characters of their archetype release or as the meta shifts away from whatever is currently being used. And frankly, that doesn't exactly feel amazing, and that's also why prior to the buffs back in 3.4, there was a ton of conversation about power creeping old characters out of relevance. I will say they're kinda counteracting this with freebies like how they've been giving us 5-star units like Archer and Dan Heng, but I mean, at least personally, I would much rather have a wider, diverse pool of units that consistently gets new additions rather than 2 freebie characters a year. At the end of the day, this is a team game where you need multiple teams to clear all the content. For a long time now, it's only been 2 teams or 8 characters, but with the new game mode Anomaly Arbitration that's coming soon, you'll need a 3rd team or 12 characters total if you want to participate. And I do want to clarify, obviously I am not trying to say that it's somehow impossible or whatever to have 12 built units, like unless you're new you probably have a few different teams built from past metas, but I am saying that only getting 2 out of the 12 characters you need isn't exactly a whole lot in comparison to how it used to be where the requirements to clear were significantly lower in terms of overall team cost. And that right there is a decent segue into talking about another point here, which is that again, this is a team game. It's not like as we've gone on or as the game has progressed, you've only ever had to replace just your DPS, for example. Usually that DPS will come with a new team requirement. Like if you want to run Break, I hope you have Ron May. If you want to run Hybrid Carry, hope you got Sunday. If you want to run an HP character, well, I hope you have Hyacine. Basically, what I'm saying here is that the characters nowadays are designed in a way where they don't function on their own, or to be more specific, they don't function to their full potential outside of the team they're intended to be played in. And really, I don't think that was ever that big of a problem until somewhere in the middle of 2.x with Break followed by follow-up teams, and it's definitely continued to happen as we've gone into 3.x. What makes this worse in my opinion is that now, unlike that period of time back in 2.x, we don't have the 4-star characters that made both of those comps more accessible, like Mose or Hunt Marsh for follow-up and the HMC or Gallagher for Break, and yes, I am actually counting the MC as a 4-star there. Really, the point I'm trying to make here is that the cost for teams isn't a gradual line where after a certain amount of time you just have to get one new character and then you wait until the next specific time you have to get another one. It's instead more like a step graph, where if you want to play a character then you need to get tons of other things for that unit, so it's a large increase in the amount of things you have to roll for all at once. All in all, at least in my opinion, this results in another reason that polls don't feel like they have the same mileage that they used to. And honestly, at this point it kind of feels like the requirements to play one character aren't just get the character anymore, because you need a specific team for them, and that's not even mentioning light cones because that is just a whole other can of worms due to how specific signature light cones are now, and also just how messed up the remembrance path as a whole is. I really do feel like the game has moved in a direction where things are almost becoming too specific, and as a result you always have to keep investing in new things because there just aren't any other options. And as a result, unless you either skip an entire meta or, spend money, it really doesn't end up feeling that great in my opinion. It kind of goes back to what I said earlier in this video. What used to feel like a luxury now feels like a necessity, and for the average player that gets their 90 pulls or so a patch, that necessity just isn't something that they can always get. One other thing that I feel is worth mentioning here is the lack of events and fun game modes that we've had pretty much since Amphorius launched. While the actual pulls we get per patch hasn't really changed all that much, I do think that despite that, the specification of teams alongside the lack of varied content throughout the game doesn't really lend itself to players enjoying themselves as much as they could be, or as much as they did in the past. Like, let's sort of ignore endgame for a second here. Back when the game launched, if you couldn't clear the endgame, there were a lot of main events that you could do, like the Ghost Hunting event or Ethereum Wars and stuff like that, and on top of that we had relatively consistent updates to the simulated universe with new worlds and also new game modes. Nowadays though, that kind of content isn't really being released to the same extent that it used to, and personally I feel this makes the disparity of needing all these new things and then more pulls to get those things worse. Like, here's a hypothetical example to explain what I mean. Let's say your favorite character back in 1.x was Kafka, because at least back then it felt like she was half the player base's favorite. And let's also say that you hate Dot as a playstyle, so instead of using a normal build for Kafka, you ran a crit Kafka build. While you could still try to brute force content, it was significantly more difficult to do so, but you know where you didn't have to brute force? Simulated universe and events. The funny thing is that the example I gave wasn't actually a hypothetical, because one of my friends actually did that and ran crit Kafka all the way through the highest difficulties of Swarm Disaster back then, and he also played it in pretty much every combat event that ran. Later on, he did the same through Golden Gears and also other events like the Ghost Hunting one, and while he doesn't play anymore, I'm sure he would have kept going with that same build and playstyle if new modes were added. But they really just haven't been. I mean, sure, we've had some updates to Divergent Universe, and we do also get some events, but the vast majority of those updates are small, and the events are usually mini-games rather than something your characters can actually interact with. So that leaves the actual endgame modes, and I guess story as well, as the only content that you have to play your characters in with weird builds, but the endgame is scaled beyond the point where super weird builds can still comfortably make it through it. For the players like my friend with Crit Kafka, or for a newer player that doesn't have all the units they need, or maybe for a player that just lost all their 50/50s and couldn't get a full team for their favorite new unit, well, there's just not a whole lot for them to actually do anymore. So when I'm talking about the disparity of needing all these pulls, I'm talking about it in the sense of some characters simply don't have content they're playable in without their special team, and therefore despite the fact that the pulls have stayed relatively consistent across the game's lifespan, the fact of the matter is we really do just need more at this point to comfortably sustain a count and all the different teams that are required now for different content. I will say we do have the Anomaly Arbitration mode releasing soon, which is actually new content, but it also appears to be more endgame content that those same weird builds or units without their best in slot team won't really be able to participate in. There was also the Currency Wars game mode they announced that's coming in 3.7, but we know next to nothing about it, so it's basically just hoping at this point. Now I know all this is just a shot in the dark, and realistically I'm just one guy ranting into the void here, but I do really think that the game has changed over the course of the 2 years it's been out from one that had a lot of flexibility and diversity to a game that's significantly more specific in its requirements than it used to be, which results in a lot more pulls being required to comfortably play the game. That said, there are actually a lot of ways this could be solved that aren't just giving us, more rolling currency or whatever. I mean, the easiest one is just simply releasing more 4 stars that are accessible to players. I talked about this briefly earlier, but it is actually natural for characters to leave the meta after a time, otherwise it just never really develops. But as that happens, new accessible characters should replace them, and I don't feel like that's currently happening at a fast enough pace, even though we do get some freebies. A more difficult route would be trying to actually balance the game, but that's a whole other point that's been talked to death now by multiple other videos of my own, and not to mention by other creators. And lastly, the other option is to just make characters that have less specific needs and therefore reintroduce more flexibility to the game. Like, don't get me wrong, Finon is a very, very cool character, but him removing the rest of his teammates from the field makes him also have very, very specific needs that not many other characters have. As another example, Hyacine being the only relevant character that buffs team-wide HP makes her invaluable for those HP teams compared to other options, and Evernight is another example in that she's hyper-specific to teams with Memo Sprites. While some of these characters are generically useful like Hyacine, that's more just because she's a busted character in general, rather than her actually being intended to be generic. I mean, who knew that a healer dealing just as much damage as a main DPS would be kinda broken? But really, in all seriousness, I don't know what the actual answer here is. Like, I've given my ideas, but at the end of the day, again, I know I'm basically just ranting into the void here. With that said, what I do know is that the pull economy doesn't feel amazing right now as a player, so I kinda just wanted to talk about it and get my thoughts and feelings out there about this. Anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. If you have some thoughts of your own on this topic, I'd love to hear about it, so feel free to leave a comment down below or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.